After the failure of the Bay of Pigs in 1961, President Kennedy decided he needed to stand up to the communists and show his leadership. He decided to increase aid to South Vietnam. The United States went from a marginal commitment of 800 military advisors under President Eisenhower to 17,000 by the time of Kennedy's death in November 1963. Most of Kennedy's advisors saw the issue as a military crisis rather than a political one. The most crucial event that led to the increase in American aid was Kennedy sending Walt Rostow and Maxwell Taylor in 1961 to evaluate the situation in South Vietnam. The Rostow-Taylor report of October 1961 expressed concern that unless the United States provided aid to the South Vietnamese government, the communists would win. The report shocked Kennedy, and it recommended increasing the American commitment to 8,000 troops. George Ball, Undersecretary of State, dissented, advising the president not to repeat the mistake of the French, and warned that increasing the American military commitment would eventually lead to the escalation of our role. Ball predicted that within 5 years we would have 300,000 troops in Vietnam. Kennedy responded to Ball, "George, you are crazier than hell." JFK's own reservations led him to alter the commitment from 8,000 combat troops that Rostow and Taylor recommended to 17,000 military advisors. The Joint Chiefs of Staff favored sending combat troops to aid the Vietnamese. Kennedy consulted retired General Douglas MacArthur, who urged Kennedy to not increase the American commitment, which he viewed as a mistake. There was also an internal disagreement how to combat the Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam. Members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon favored a conventional war similar to the previous conflict in Korea and urged training the Vietnamese to prepare for a North Vietnamese invasion. Walt Rostow, an economic historian, and political scientist Roger Hilsman, a veteran guerrilla fighter from World War II, advised counterinsurgency warfare that had worked against communist guerrillas in the Philippines after World War II. General Edward Lansdale had a legendary record in counterinsurgency warfare. The president favored that approach and increased the size of the special forces so that by the end of 1963, about 115,000 American soldiers received training in counterinsurgency warfare. However, the Pentagon disagreed, refused to send Lansdale to Vietnam, refused to train the South Vietnamese in counterinsurgency warfare, and only sent a small number of Green Berets to Vietnam by the end of 1963. Neither the press nor Congress criticized the increased American involvement in South Vietnam. Public opinion polls in 1963 suggested American support for an even larger role in Vietnam to stop the communists. However, by the spring of 1963, President Kennedy began to express doubts about the commitment to Vietnam. He came to agree with Ball that the American role would lead to escalation. By this point, about 20 Americans had been killed in combat because of the role of Americans as military advisors. Kennedy told Democratic Senator Mike Mansfield that he planned to withdraw all American military advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1965. But he could do nothing until after the 1964 elections. As he told Mansfield, "In 1965 I will be damned as a communist appeaser, but I don't care. If I tried to pull out now, we would have another Joe McCarthy Red Scare on our hands. But I can do it after I am reelected." To show he meant this, he removed 1,000 military advisors in the fall of 1963. On October 2, 1963, he told the National Security Council that he would remove all American troops by the end of 1965. President Eisenhower planned to meet with Nikita Khrushchev in 1960, but the flak over the shooting down of a U-2 pilot over the Soviet Union killed the summit. Instead, Kennedy decided to follow through with a meeting that took place in Vienna in June 1961. The Soviet leader lectured Kennedy, and Khrushchev bullied and goaded the president. Khrushchev came out of the meeting thinking he could push the new president around because he lacked the experience as a national leader. Initially, the Soviet leader had more respect for former President Eisenhower than Kennedy. The Soviets and Americans agreed to one compromise at Vienna. Both sides endorsed keeping Laos neutral in the Cold War. Kennedy did not want to get involved in a second civil war in Asia. They failed to reach agreements on other Cold War issues like Vietnam or Germany. Weeks after the Vienna meeting, 20,000 East Germans fled to West Germany. The continued flight of people because of the lack of jobs and educational resources, as well as the desire of men to avoid military service in East Germany, embarrassed the East Germans and the Russians. The problem with the workers' paradise was the workers wanted to leave for the decadent West. To end the exodus of people to the West, the East Germans, with Soviet approval, decided to build a wall to prevent future escape to the West from East Berlin. The Communists began building the wall a few weeks after Kennedy returned from Vienna. He called for a meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council to decide on what action to take in response. Kennedy wanted to deal with the issue as a political problem, not a military problem, the same approach he used in the Cuban Missile Crisis. By contrast, the military CIA and former Secretary of State Dean Acheson urged a massive military buildup of Western forces in West Berlin to force the Russians and East Germans to back down. The president wanted to find a way out for Khrushchev so that the Soviet leader could retreat gracefully. The construction of the wall also raised the question that the Soviets might try to push the Western allies out of West Berlin. The problem was President Kennedy felt he had to convince the Soviet leader that the United States would fight for Berlin without actually having to do so. Nikita went back and forth over the summer of 1961, offering compromise, threatening a separate peace with East Germany, and threatening nuclear warfare. In the end, Khrushchev appeared to favor the Chinese wall strategy of sealing off East Berlin, but not taking hostile actions against Western powers in Berlin. The August 15th headline of the Washington Post was "Reds Tighten Seal-Off in Berlin." The East Germans stopped all of its citizens from entering the West Berlin, but allowed Allied personnel on official business free travel back and forth. One other problem appeared. What effect would the wall have on the morale of West Berliners who had routinely visited relatives or shopped in East Berlin? American representatives traveled to Berlin to shore up public morale. An American military unit, 1st Battle Group of the 18th Infantry, was sent along the access roads from West Germany to West Berlin to test if the Soviets or East Germans would try to stop the American convoy. They did not. Apparently, the New Berlin crisis had been resolved with the Soviets and East Germans closing off East Berlin without making any attempt to force the West out of West Berlin. East Germans turned a barbed wire fence into a substantial wall that emerged as a symbol of the Cold War and the division of Germany. American Presidents Kennedy and Ronald Reagan would use the wall as a backdrop when they visited Berlin to emphasize the lack of freedom in the communist world compared to the West. The crisis in Berlin flared up again a few months later when in October 1961 the East Germans stopped American diplomats from entering East Berlin. On October 25, 1961, General Clay, commander of American troops in Berlin, ordered 10 M48 tanks to Checkpoint Charlie, guns pointed at the East Berlin police to pressure the East Germans to allow the American diplomats access to East Berlin. The Soviets then brought up their own tanks. When American diplomats tried to enter East Berlin on October 27th, the East German police stopped them. The Americans brought up 10 tanks again in retaliation to Checkpoint Charlie, and the Soviets countered with 10 tanks of their own. Soviet and American tanks and soldiers were now in direct confrontation in Berlin. Nikita Khrushchev overruled middle-level Russian officials in Berlin and ordered the Soviet tanks withdrawn, and when they left, the Americans withdrew. The cat-and-mouse game in Berlin ended because neither the Soviet leader nor President Kennedy wanted an escalation of the crisis in Berlin.